This episode is brought to you by the channel patrons who suggested and voted on this topic. This was a very enjoyable episode to make, and there is a part of me that is very sad to be done with it now. If you, dear viewer, would like to support the show and suggest and vote on topics, you can do so on Patreon. Also, special thanks to Atlas Altera for helping with the map for this episode. He's got a new video on his channel discussing the origins of different drinks around the world, chocolate among them, so give it a look after this episode. And now back to our regularly scheduled program. Chocolate. I love it, you love it. We all love chocolate. Whether it's a chocolate cake for dessert, chocolates on Valentine's Day, oven fresh chocolate chip cookies, or a cup of hot cocoa on a cold day, it's near and dear to all of us. Having a bad day? Treat yourself to some chocolate ice cream. I can hardly do justice to the impact chocolate has had on world cuisine. Although most of us think of chocolate as a sweet flavor or candy, for most of its history, it's been a bitter but flavorful drink, often reserved for specific groups in society. Chocolate has always had a huge cultural impact wherever it's been introduced, and Mesoamerica was no exception. They could never get enough of it. They were as crazy about it back then as we still are today. Let's explore the fascinating but often overlooked history of chocolate in the pre-Columbian Americas. To discuss the origins of chocolate, we need to talk about the cacao tree, Theobroma cacao. And for those of you who are intrigued by the name of this episode, all I did was translate the scientific name, because frankly, it's perfect. Theobroma, in its original Greek, means food of the gods, a very appropriate name. But back to the tree itself. The cacao tree is a small understory tree, never exceeding 8 meters or 26 feet. Being a tropical plant, it requires very exact conditions to thrive and will only grow in hot, moist conditions within 20 degrees north or south of the equator. Should anything like frost or drought interrupt these conditions, the tree will not be able to thrive. Another condition that is often underappreciated by cacao growers are the midges that pollinate the tiny flowers produced by the tree. They are vital to the life of the cacao tree. Where midges fare poorly, so does the cacao tree. Once a tree is planted, it usually takes about 3 to 4 years for the tree to bear its fruit, the cacao pods. Cacao pods come in a variety of colors. The pods are cauliflorous, which means that they sprout on the trunk and larger branches. If you're used to seeing fruits like apples, pears, and oranges on the ends of tree branches, these look almost alien, like something out of a cheap sci-fi film from the 60s. And if you think that's weird, just wait until you open them up, because it doesn't look anything like chocolate in there. The cacao beans are encased in a slimy, fleshy pulp. Just to get it out of the way, cacao beans are actually seeds and not technically beans. They're called beans because of their size and shape, and I'm going to be calling them beans in this episode. Just don't get confused, and remember to be careful around your more pedantic friends. The cacao tree relies on animals and humans to disperse the seeds. It has no way of naturally opening and dispersing the seeds itself. Bats, rodents, and monkeys love cacao pods for the sweet pulp, but will avoid the bitter seeds and disperse them. The cacao beans get their bitter flavor from the presence of two alkaloids, theobromine and caffeine. These chemicals are important not just to the chocolate, but also because they provide scientists with very important chemical markers, as we'll see later. Now, some of you may be wondering how you turn these curious cacao beans into the chocolate that we know and love, so let's take a small detour to discuss that. Chocolate has a very strict basic recipe that has not changed over thousands of years, and that recipe has 4 vital steps. Regardless of what kind of technology you have, any aspiring chocolatier is going to follow these. The first step is fermentation. In this step, the beans are removed from the cacao pod and left outside to ferment. Fermentation lasts for 3 to 6 days, depending on the type of cacao and local conditions. During this time, 2 important things happen. First, the pulp on the seeds liquefies and falls off. Second, the seeds germinate but are killed by the high temperatures and acidity, which is what produces the chocolate flavor. This is key because ungerminated seeds will not produce a chocolate flavor. Once the fermentation is complete, the beans are dried out for 1 to 2 weeks where they lose more than half their weight. After drying, the beans are roasted for 70 to 115 minutes, which helps produce the flavor and aroma that we love so much. The last step is winnowing, in which the thin shell of the bean is removed. With this last step complete, the beans can be ground into powder and made into chocolate. Easy peasy. Now back to the cacao tree itself. Theobroma cacao has two subspecies, Criollo and Forastero. Criollo, grown historically in Mesoamerica, is characterized by long, soft, warty pods with deep ridges. It's more disease prone and produces less cacao than the Forastero variety, but its cacao beans and resulting chocolate have been considered to be of superior quality. On the other hand, the Forastero, which is historically grown in South America, produces harder, rounder, melon like pods and is hardier and more productive. Technically, there is a third variety, Trinitario, which is a crossbreed of both subspecies that was first produced in the Caribbean in the 18th century. Speaking of geography, let's talk about where exactly cacao is found. Traditionally, the cacao tree is grown in northern South America, throughout Central America, and in the area of southeastern Mexico. But scientists are still uncertain how much of this range is actually natural. There's a lot of debate on the natural range and spread of the cacao tree. It's actually been a bit difficult to tease out because there's a lot of wild varieties that can't always be distinguished from domesticated trees that escaped back into the wild. That said, however, the general consensus is that the cacao tree's origins lie in the upper Amazon basin, because that's where the most genetic diversity among cacao trees are found, and where most of its close relatives are located. Most have interpreted this lack of genetic diversity among cacao trees in Mesoamerica as a result of its more recent arrival in the area, though some scholars disagree. How the tree made its way from its Amazonian cradle to the rest of Central America and Mexico is an unresolved debate, and there's a few theories. One theory states that the cacao tree was taken out of South America and moved north by humans after it was first domesticated. Others have proposed that the tree spread naturally or with humans northwards along trade routes, and then was later domesticated in Mesoamerica. Still, others propose that it was domesticated twice, once in Mesoamerica and once in South America. I don't want to get bogged down in the weeds on this issue, otherwise, we'll be here all day, and we've got a lot to cover. Check out the bibliography if you want to read up on it. For now, let's discuss its relationship with humans. As I mentioned before, cacao fruits contain a tasty pulp that attracts animals, and this is probably what initially enticed humans. This pulp can be made into a fruit beverage or can be fermented into an alcoholic drink. Even today, it's not uncommon in Brazil to find shops selling juices made from the cacao pulp. Other medicinal uses of the cacao tree and its fruit have been documented by ethnographers in South America. Similar uses for the cacao tree's closest relative, the jaguar tree, are also very well documented. If we look at archaeology, the earliest known cacao use comes from the Mayo Chinchipe culture in modern day Ecuador about 5,000 years ago, although in this instance, it's believed to have been wild cacao. As much as ancient people in South America enjoyed the cacao fruit, there's no evidence that they were ever creating chocolate before colonization. In case you're wondering why cacao beans never took off in South America, especially when it's a ready source of caffeine, it's probably due to the fact that the ancient people of South America had access to more stimulants that required less processing than the cacao bean, such as coca, yerba mate, and guayusa, to name a few. That's the benefit of living next to the Amazon, nature's biodiversity superstore. For the people in Mesoamerica, cacao was a game changer. Once the domesticated cacao tree reached Mesoamerica, it took off. Recent research indicates that cacao was likely domesticated roughly 3,600 years ago, most likely around the Pacific coastal plains of Chiapas. This area, the Soconusco, would later be famous for its high quality chocolate production, although today it's actually a big coffee producing region. The earliest evidence of chocolate production and consumption come from this region and date to about 1800 to 1400 BCE. This culture, referred to in archaeology as the Bara phase, was made up of maize farmers eking out a living on the coastal plains. However, their elegant pottery shows that not only were they storing and drinking chocolate, but also that they were treating this as a prized product. Now, some of you thoughtful viewers may be wondering how archaeologists can prove that chocolate was being drunk back then. After all, these are very humid, wet tropical environments where organic material is going to age like milk before it disappears. As it turns out, scientists have figured out a wonderful way to detect chocolate by analyzing pottery. When chocolate is stored in a ceramic vessel, it leaves a chemical residue on the walls of the pot that can be analyzed for the presence of theobromine and caffeine, the alkaloids produced by the cacao bean that we mentioned earlier. This gives archaeologists an extremely reliable way to detect chocolate in the archaeological record. But back to our story. As instrumental as the Bara people were for inventing chocolate, the people who really deserve credit with selling chocolate to wider Mesoamerica are the Olmec. I've already discussed the legacy of the Olmec in Mesoamerica in a previous episode, and chocolate was one of the many Mesoamerican mainstays that they popularized. At the site of El Manatee, ceramics with traces of chocolate residue have been found dating to 1350 BCE. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the Olmec regarding chocolate, however, was the very word cacao. This word, cacao, or some variant of it, appears across Mesoamerica in many different languages and language families. Linguists have traced this word to the ancient Mixe-Sokian word kaka, or kakawa. Although there is some debate on this, many scholars believe that this language, which was native to the Gulf Coast area, was probably spoken by the Olmecs themselves. Because of the Olmecs' cultural impact, many other Mesoamerican languages borrowed their words for various prestige items, including their word for chocolate. It's probably safe to say that chocolate was an easy sell for the Olmec because it took off in the rest of Mesoamerica and even beyond, as we'll see later. People could not get enough of this delicious drink. From the Olmec, chocolate spread across Mesoamerica, and from that point, we see chocolate appearing in different cultures. One culture that left us a lot of evidence of early chocolate consumption was the Maya, so let's turn our attention there. Recent archaeological studies date the earliest cacao use among the Maya to about 600 BCE. Unfortunately, most of the early evidence for cacao consumption is biased towards the elite because they were the ones writing the books. As a result, our knowledge of how common Maya people consumed cacao during ancient times is poor, although we know from archaeology that common people did have access to it. For the elite, chocolate was an important beverage in feasting rites and rituals. It's not hard to find court scenes with chocolate in Maya art, especially in painted ceramics. This image here represents the earliest depiction of chocolate being made. If you're wondering why it's being poured this way, it's to build up a foam, which was very desirable, not just to the Maya, but to many Mesoamerican tastes. Many of these lavishly decorated drinking vessels were made specifically for drinking chocolate, and there's no ambiguity here because the Maya wrote exactly what they were for. Here's the Maya glyph for cacao that appears on so many of these vessels. For anyone who's curious on how to read this, the fish face stands for the syllable ka, and the two dots here mean that the syllable is said twice. To the right of the fish is the symbol for wa, so this would literally spell kakawa, although literate Maya would have understood that very last vowel to be unspoken, which leaves cacao. I do want to note that the glyph can be written in other ways too, so it may not always look like this. These vessels contain a line of standard text that has been called the primary standard sequence that dedicates the drinking vessel to a person or god, lists the contents of the vessel, and then closes with the name of the patron who commissioned the vessel. This sequence can refer to a number of foods and drinks intended to be served with these wares, but one of the most common drinks these inscriptions refer to is chocolate. These give us a glimpse into how these elite Maya prepared and drank their cacao. Many such texts describe different flavors or recipes, such as bitter cacao, tree fresh cacao, fruity cacao, or foamy cacao. This is a good time to point out that chocolate wasn't just a single drink. It was a drink that could be prepared in many different ways with many different flavorings and served at different temperatures, though it's likely that it was often served hot. Just think of how many types of coffee we have today, and that should give you an idea. These jars and cups would have been prestige items and symbols of political connections and patronage, but they are also commonly found in elite tombs as burial goods. Cacao was one of the foods and drinks that would sustain the dead in the afterlife. A good example comes from the site of Rio Azul in modern day Guatemala. Here, an undisturbed royal tomb, Tomb 19, was excavated in 1984, and several jars and vessels were recovered, and they tested positive for chocolate. As far as the Maya were concerned, you could take it all with you, even your chocolate. Just a side note here, one of the more interesting cacao vessels found in this tomb was actually a lidded vessel with a screw top lid. This is long before screw on lids ever took off anywhere else. I thought it was cool and worth mentioning. But cacao had far deeper mythological significance to the Maya. Cacao had a special prominence among fruit trees to the Maya, and it pops up in a lot of religious art. Cacao even had its own divine patron, Ecchua. Colonial sources reported that offerings involving feathers and sacrificed dogs were made in the month of Muan to him. However, the most famous god with connections to cacao is actually the maize god. If you want to know more about the maize god, the hero twins, and their adventures, I'd recommend checking out my video on the Popol Vuh, the Maya creation myth. In that story, as colonial sources recorded it, the severed head of the maize god Hunhunappu was hung in a calabash tree by the lords of the underworld. However, there are depictions of this scene from pre-colonial times that show his head hung in a cacao tree. For those that remember the rest of the story, he magically impregnates a daughter of one of the Lords of Death, and she gives birth to the hero twins, Hunahpu and Xbalanque, who eventually return to the underworld and resurrect their father. Other ancient depictions of the maize god's death and resurrection show his lifeless body in the underworld sprouting various fruit trees, cacao among them. These newly sprouted trees come under the patronage of god El, one of the gods of the underworld, and although he's more commonly associated with merchants, he's often displayed with cacao. Once the maize god was resurrected by his twin sons, they brought cacao and the other fruits to the surface for all of mankind. In fact, there are depictions of the maize god that show him as the world tree, sprouting cacao pods. Thus, cacao was a symbol of death and rebirth to the ancient Maya. The Maya were well experienced cacao cultivators who managed to grow it not just in their tropical backyard, but also in the northern Yucatan. Remember, the cacao tree needs a very wet and humid environment to flourish, and the northern Yucatan is very dry, so this is much more impressive than it initially sounds. To do this, they planted cacao trees in sinkholes and cenotes. These areas had enough moisture to allow the trees to grow. Very ingenious. Now, the Maya were not the only people in Mesoamerica at this time who were enjoying and cultivating chocolate. Cultivation could be found further south and east in Central America. Other noted areas include the Azalcos area of modern El Salvador and the greater Nicoya region of Nicaragua and Costa Rica, the latter representing the southern limit of pre-colonial cacao production as far as archaeology and history can tell. In these areas on the fringe of Mesoamerica, cacao assumed similarly important cultural and economic functions, although it never became an export product as we'll see in other areas. There is some debate about whether cacao was introduced by later Nahuatl migrants, but there's some pretty compelling evidence that cacao production in these areas predates those migrations. But demand for cacao wasn't limited to the restricted environment where it was cultivated. It had a very wide appeal and was in high demand in other areas. That meant that many in Mesoamerica, if not most, who wanted cacao had to trade for it. The desire for chocolate fueled a booming trade that stretched the length of Mesoamerica and beyond. The Patun Maya in the Terminal and Post Classic were famous traders who could move goods across Mesoamerica by canoe or by foot, and they likely played a large role in moving cacao into the highlands of central Mexico. But cacao didn't stop in central Mexico. Cacao was traded as far away as the American Southwest. Ceramic analysis has shown that the Hohokam and the inhabitants of Chaco Canyon both had access to chocolate despite being well over 1,000 kilometers away from the nearest cacao tree. Cacao was truly the crude oil of its day in Mesoamerica. In fact, chocolate and cacao beans were so desired in Mesoamerica that they became a de facto currency. Cacao beans could be traded for just about anything in ancient times. This might sound odd, but it was actually more practical than you might think. Not only were they universally prized, but their small size and large quantities allowed for small transactions. A few beans could buy you something small. Not only that, cacao beans were durable and could be stored for years without spoiling. In the 16th century, conquistador Hernando de Oviedo y Valdez reported that in Nicaragua, a rabbit could be bought for 10 cacao beans and a slave for 100 beans, give or take. Over in Tlaxcala, colonial records report that a good turkey hen could be expected to sell for 100 beans, a turkey egg for 3 beans, a ripe avocado for 3 beans, and a large tomato for 1 bean. The Spanish even reported that Montezuma II had warehouses of over 900 million cacao beans. If you wanted to be rich in Mesoamerica, you invested in cacao beans. It was all about the Benjamins. For those who want a much better joke, this one gets repeated often by archaeologists and scholars discussing cacao as currency, and I can't resist repeating it here. Mesoamerica was the only place in history where money literally grew on trees. Oh, and just like any other currency out there, there were counterfeit cacao beans. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún reported during colonial times that counterfeiting was common among the Aztecs, and we quote,
The bad cacao seller sells cacao beans which are placed in hot ashes, toasted, made full in fire. He counterfeits by making fresh cacao beans whitish. He places them in hot ashes, steers them into hot ashes, then treats them with chalky earth, with wet earth. He steers them into wet earth, with amaranth dough, wax, avocado pits, broken into pieces which are then shaped like cacao beans. He counterfeits cacao. He covers this with cacao bean hulls. He places this in the cacao bean shells. The whitish, the fresh cacao beans, he intermixes, mingles, throws in, introduces, ruins with the shrunken, the chili sit like, the broken, the hollow, the tiny. Indeed, he throws in with them the wild cacao beans to deceive the people.
proof that some things never change. And speaking of the Aztecs, if there's one culture that can inform us a lot about Mesoamerican chocolate use, it's them. Now, when I say Aztecs, I mean the Mexica, who were one of the many Nahuatl speaking ethnic groups in central Mexico at Spanish contact. These groups, by most accounts, were actually recent migrants, likely having traveled around the 13th century from the Bajío region into central Mexico. There, they adopted existing traditions of city building, statehood, and culture, including cacao use. The Mexica were among the latest of these Nahuatl groups to settle down when they founded their city of Tenochtitlan, but it would go on to become the largest city in the pre-Columbian Americas and the head of what we know as the Aztec Empire. Depending on your definition, many or all of those other Nahuatl groups and states could be considered Aztec, even the ones not inside the Aztec Empire, and that empire also included groups which weren't Nahuas at all. But just to keep things simple, and for the purposes of this video, when I say Aztec, I mean Mexica. The point is that when the Mexica arrived and settled down in the area, they fully embraced chocolate. The Aztecs, and all the inhabitants of central Mexico for that matter, used the same tried and true techniques for turning cacao beans into chocolate that we discussed earlier. Like their Maya contemporaries, they also appreciated a good head of froth on their chocolate, which they achieved by repeatedly pouring chocolate back and forth, as seen in this illustration here. By the way, some of you who are familiar with chocolate making in Mexico today may be wondering if molinillos or swizzle sticks were used to create the foam, and those appear to be a later Spanish invention, although a few colonial sources mention stirring spoons used by the Aztecs. Most sources state that the Aztec took their chocolate cold, unlike their Maya counterparts who reportedly drank it hot. However, we also know that different brews were served at different temperatures based on the ingredients and preparation. It's suspected that the reason the cold serving temperature is often referenced for Aztec chocolate is due to the humoral attributes that the Spanish later ascribed to it. Colonial sources also distinguish between fine chocolate, tlaquetzali, and an inferior type that was mixed with maize to make a chocolate-flavored gruel. Speaking of additives, the Aztecs had their own recipes for making cacao and chocolate with a variety of different ingredients. We should note that not all of these ingredients were used to enhance flavor. Some of these had medicinal uses rather than culinary uses. One popular ingredient for chocolate was, of all things, ground powdered chili peppers, which produced a drink called chilcacahuat. That may sound a bit weird, but Michael and Sophie Coe, in their seminal book, The True History of Chocolate, informed the reader that they would make their own chocolate ice cream with chilies, and that the pairing of these flavors was excellent. So I got curious and decided to make my own chili-flavored chocolate drink by mixing unsweetened cocoa powder with chili powder in water, and it was actually much better than I expected. But let's set aside my eccentrics and get back on track here. Another very popular flavor was the dried petals of the sacred ear flower, which the Aztecs would have called xochinacatzli. This added a spicy flavor to the chocolate that later Spanish compared to black pepper, nutmeg, allspice, and cinnamon. Another common spice used for flavoring that I think most listeners will appreciate was vanilla, which was native to the tropical lowlands and a very desired import in its own right. Another sweet ingredient that could be added was honey. Other additives could include crushed ceiba seeds, mecachochit, allspice, acuyo, mame sapote, and Mexican magnolia, and that's not even a comprehensive list. There's also some evidence that alcohol may have been mixed with chocolate because our old friend Bernardino de Sahagún noted that excesses of chocolate could intoxicate the drinker, which would only be possible if alcoholic or psychotropic ingredients were added. There's also some evidence that the Aztecs ate chocolate in a solid form, but the sources are vague, so it's uncertain whether this refers to some sort of confection or the beans themselves. The main takeaway here is that the Aztecs could take their chocolate in one of many satisfying and refreshing ways. Unfortunately, when I say Aztecs, I actually mean the Aztec elites because they considered chocolate to be a drink reserved for the upper classes. We aren't certain if this was common for other peoples of the empire. Chocolate may have been more available for other cultures, and there's some evidence to corroborate that, but no one is certain. For the Aztec elite, however, it was synonymous with cultured refinement. In fact, according to Nahuatl traditions, cacao was a legacy from the Toltecs and was bestowed on them by Quetzalcoatl, not the god, mind you, but the mythical, legendary, and possibly historical man and Toltec ruler Seacatopiltzin Quetzalcoatl, who, it was said, discovered cacao of different colors. Just an FYI, you'll sometimes see people on the internet say that Quetzalcoatl gave chocolate to humanity against the god's wishes, like Prometheus with fire. However, in all my research, I could not find a primary source for this, and I suspect that this has come from someone conflating Quetzalcoatl the man with Quetzalcoatl the god. Darn Toltecs making trouble for us again. If anyone knows a primary source for this, let me know in the comments. For Aztec poets, chocolate was the ultimate symbol of luxury and sensuality. For the elites, chocolate would have been an important part of high society and feasting. It was typically served at the end of a meal after everyone had eaten, much like some people will do coffee after dessert. Prominent figures at these feasts would sip their chocolate from gourd or calabash cups, while the lesser guests drank from ceramic cups. One other group that had access to chocolate was warriors. Moctezuma I had ruled that those who did not go to war could not consume chocolate or other rare foods. This stuff was off limits to the common people unless they were willing to suit up for military service. I know that we don't typically think of chocolate as a martial and masculine food, but the Aztecs thought so, and it was an important part of military rations. Chocolate was baked into a wafer that could be carried in a pack with other foods. Not a bad army ration if I do say so myself. However, if there's one class that we need to highlight in this discussion about the Aztecs and chocolate, it's the Posteca. Who were the Posteca, you ask? The Posteca were a small special group of long distance merchants who would facilitate commerce and communication beyond the empire's borders. The Spanish actually wrote a lot about the Posteca, and as interesting as they are, we can't go into all of it here, so we're going to keep this cursory and stick to the parts that pertain to chocolate. Posteca traders were invaluable in bringing prized exotic foreign goods into the marketplaces of the empire. Among these goods would have been resplendent feathers, jaguar pelts, amber, and of course, cacao beans. You might have noticed that these goods have a tropical vibe to them, and that's not a coincidence. We mentioned earlier how cacao was widely traded outside of its tropical home, and the Posteca were heavily involved in this trade, journeying to the Soconusco to bring back chocolate. Many became fabulously wealthy from this trade, sometimes even rivaling the wealth of the nobility itself. Because the Posteca were technically considered warriors because they were armed and sometimes were expected to fight, they could also consume chocolate and were noted connoisseurs of it, hosting large banquets to purchase social clout in Aztec society. In fact, chocolate was so desired by the Aztec elites that it fueled conquest. In 1486, Ahuitzotl led the Aztec armies to the Soconusco and annexed it, the farthest province they ever conquered, and a very good one at that. Remember, this was the same area that saw the earliest recorded cacao production, so it had a long history of cacao cultivation. In many ways, this was the jewel of the empire, and chocolate was part of their tribute to the Aztecs. Interestingly, though, there was also some ambivalence to chocolate among the Mexica. See, they had once been poor, savage warriors that had risen to glory by their courage and martial prowess. As Mexica rulers became increasingly urbane and rich from conquest, exotic luxuries flowed into Tenochtitlan. Many critics denounced the corrupting influence that these had on the Mexica. In their view, Mexica's strength had been a product of their austerity, and all this new luxury was making them lazy and soft. In their eyes, real men were supposed to drink pulque instead of that fancy sissy chocolate stuff. So yes, ancient Mesoamerica was not immune from the elderly complaining about the kids these days. Those musings aside, chocolate often became a symbol of Aztec decadence and excess. One story that really captures this well comes from the Spanish friar Diego Duran's The History of the Indies of New Spain. In this story, Duran records that Montezuma I allegedly dispatched an envoy to Aztlan, the purported ancestral home of the Aztecs. Upon reaching Aztlan, the members of the envoy presented gifts to Coatlicue, the mother of Huitzilopochtli. Upon offering chocolate to the goddess, they were warned by an elder.
You have become old. You have become tired because of the chocolate you drink and because of the foods you eat. They have harmed and weakened you. You have been spoiled by those mantles, feathers, and riches that you wear and that brought you here.
Chocolate also had important ritual and symbolic functions among the Aztec. In the Codex Feovari Mayor, the Aztec cosmos is illustrated with four directions emanating from the center. Each direction has its own tree, and the south tree, pointing to the land of the dead, is none other than the Cacao Tree, next to which stands Mictlantecutli, the god of the dead and the ruler of the underworld. Atop the tree is a scarlet macaw, the bird of the hot lands from which the finest cacao came. Chocolate was also frequently linked to blood, and the cacao pod itself to the human heart, since both were repositories of precious and valuable liquids, blood and chocolate. One ingredient that I deliberately didn't mention earlier was achiote. The crushed seeds of this shrub produce a dye that would have given the chocolate a red and bloody appearance. In fact, the Aztecs even made a brew of chocolate called itzpacalat with human blood from a sacrificial knife. This was used for a special ritual in which a captive would impersonate Quetzalcoatl, the god this time, not the man, until he was due to be sacrificed. Upon hearing the news from the temple elders of his impending demise, he would drink the itzpacalat to allay his fears of death and to keep him from getting cold feet before the sacrifice. The Aztecs are a good example of just how deeply prized chocolate was. For them, it was a luxury reserved for the highest echelons of society, which is a stark contrast to what we saw in the more tropical regions of Mesoamerica, where chocolate was available to most people. It was deeply woven into mythology and culture. But chocolate was about to be changed forever by the arrival of the Spanish into the Americas. The first recorded European to actually encounter chocolate is none other than Christopher Columbus himself. During his fourth voyage in 1502 off the coast of Honduras, Columbus came across and captured a massive trading canoe crewed by the Petun Maya. These people would have been completely different from the Caribbean inhabitants he had met on his earlier voyages, and this made him very curious. Among the cargo that Columbus inspected were cotton garments, war clubs, axes, copper bells, and cacao beans. His son Ferdinand noted the importance of cacao beans to these traders.
For their provisions, they had such roots and grains as are eaten in Hispaniola, and a sort of wine made out of maize which resembled English beer. And many of those almonds, they seemed to hold these almonds at a great price. For I observed that whenever any of these almonds fell, they all stooped to pick it up, as if an eye had fallen.
Columbus, however, never got to taste chocolate. It wouldn't be until the conquest of Mexico that the Spanish would actually begin drinking it. Initially, the conquistadors were repulsed by chocolate as they were by most indigenous food. They found the bitterness unpalatable. However, as a class of Spanish native Creoles began to emerge, chocolate began to find appeal in Spanish circles, particularly among Spanish women who had emigrated from Spain. Now, the Spanish did not take chocolate wholesale from the Aztecs. Although they kept the same basic process for turning cacao beans into chocolate, they made some changes to the traditional chocolate recipes. First, they served their chocolate hot. This may have been an independent development, but it's possible that this may have been something that they learned from the Maya. Second, they sweetened the chocolate to cut the bitterness, most commonly with cane sugar. Third, they substituted Old World spices such as cinnamon, anise seed, and black pepper for the native spices that we discussed earlier. Lastly, they changed the method of creating froth from pouring the chocolate back and forth to using wooden molinillos or swizzle sticks. During the colonial period, chocolate and cacao continued to be important resources for the native populations inside and outside of Spanish control. Because cacao beans could be used as currency, the Spanish wasted no time in exploiting its value among indigenous people, even if they didn't drink chocolate themselves. During the Aztec conquest, conquistadors stole huge stores of cacao beans, knowing full well how valuable they were. After the conquest, it remained a highly sought after commodity both inside and outside of Spanish control. Remember what we said earlier. Cacao was a perfectly acceptable means to pay the wages of native laborers. Even the Catholic Church got in on this action. If you ever go to the cathedral in Mexico City today, which, mind you, is right next to where the ancient Templo Mayor once stood, you might see this statue in the Capilla de San Jose, with offerings of cacao beans at its base. This statue, the Christ of Cacao or Lord of Cacao, dates to the 16th century, and it was fashioned as a means for natives to offer up cacao beans as alms to the church. This was a useful source of income for the priests at the cathedral, and later records indicate that many monks in Mexico were avid chocolate drinkers. Even unconquered indigenous producers remained very active in the cacao trade. The Itzamaya, who weren't fully subjugated by the Spanish until 1697, were avid cacao producers who used the cacao trade to enrich themselves and even competed with Spanish traders. Before we continue, I do want to take a detour and discuss the etymology of the word chocolate. You'll often hear that chocolate is a loan word from Nahuatl, and while that makes for a neat and tidy explanation, the truth, as it often is much more complicated and weird. What if I told you that no Aztec prior to the Spanish conquest ever used the word chocolate? But ancient America, as I hear you saying, that doesn't make any sense. Chocolate comes from the Nahuatl word chocolate, which means cacao water. As it turns out, that etymology is highly unlikely. Professional linguists will point out that the root choco doesn't exist in Nahuatl, because the ch sound is never followed by an o. More importantly, though, the word chocolate or chocolate never appears in a single early source on the Nahuatl language or Aztec culture. Some people in the back might want to chime in and say that the original Nahuatl word isn't chocolate, but chocoat, meaning bitter water. While this is a better theory, it's still not likely because there'd be no linguistic reason for European speakers to change the sh to a ch sound and to insert an L. If you're curious what the original Nahuatl word for chocolate was, it was cacahuat, literally cacao water. Recall from earlier that cacao had been the pan-Mesoamerican word for chocolate since Olmec times. So where does the word chocolate come from? Spanish sources began using the word chocolate near the end of the 16th century, and it's worth noting that the Spanish were using this word, not the natives. How or where did they get choco? Tragically, no one is certain. One theory is that chocolate comes from the Nahuatl word chicoli, which means cacao beater, and that it somehow eventually morphed into chocoli and then got picked up as chocolate. Another idea is that the Spanish picked up their words for cacao not in central Mexico, but in the Yucatan, where the Mayan words chacao ha and chocol ha, both of which mean hot water, became the Spanish term for chocolate. But at some point, the Mayan ha was replaced by the Nahuatl at for water. Okay, that sounds a bit more plausible. Michael and Sophie Coe tackle this question from a different angle, and I think it's worth considering. They looked at why the Spanish would not have adopted the simple cacao root for chocolate. They point out that in Spanish, like many other Romance languages, caca is usually a childish term for feces, like how toddlers will use the word poo in English. It doesn't take much to imagine the Spanish being uncomfortable describing a bitter, frothy, brown drink with the word caca. So there may have been a lot of incentive to settle on a different word for cacao, and one way or another, we got chocolate. Again, this is just a theory, but one in my opinion that merits consideration. I doubt we'll ever find the exact etymology of the word chocolate, but it's a subject that there's endless debate about. Now that that's out of the way, let's get back to the history. Once chocolate started getting exported back to Europe, it took off. Just as it had been a mainstay of Mesoamerican elite society, so chocolate went into the courts, palaces, and mansions of the European elite. By the early 17th century, it was becoming a common sight at the Spanish court. Originally used for medicinal purposes, it slowly caught on because of its flavor. There's actually a lot of interesting history about the incorporation of chocolate into the humoral theory of European medicine, as well as religious debates about whether or not it was sinful to consume chocolate. Unfortunately, we don't have time for that today, but if you're interested, check out the bibliography as always. From Spain, it spread to the rest of Europe, where it captured the hearts of everyone. Keep in mind that this is before coffee and tea had really taken off in Europe, so chocolate was king, and in fact, many people used to drink chocolate in the morning as a stimulant. In time, chocolate would eventually become a popular commodity and be turned from a drink into chocolate bars and candy that we're familiar with today. This is where familiar flavors and ingredients such as milk and nuts start getting added into the mix. Now, we aren't going to go into the more modern history of chocolate, nor the questionable ethics of the chocolate trade, which can be very exploitative and involve child slavery. It's pretty messed up and tragic. But if you're interested in that, there's plenty of well made resources online. It's just that it's outside the focus of this channel. Whenever I've seen chocolate discussed in educational contexts, its ancient history usually gets little more than quick lip service. I hope that you can now appreciate what a rich history chocolate has. It's important to humans, the journey that chocolate makes from the tree to the cacao bean to chocolate. The next time that you pour yourself a nice cup of cocoa on a cold day, remember that you're enjoying a flavor that has a rich 3,000-year history, a delight that was beloved by kings and commoners alike. And that's going to wrap us up for today. Hope you all enjoyed this episode on one of the greatest flavors on earth, to which we owe Mesoamerica our undying gratitude. Once again, a special thanks to my patrons for selecting this episode. I enjoyed it immensely. If you would like to join the ranks of these fine individuals and support the show, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the description. Also, a special thanks to Majora Z for his help in the research of this episode. It was invaluable. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook. Just a quick announcement, this will be the final episode of 2023, and I want to thank everyone for what an incredible year it's been. But now, I bid you all a wonderful holiday. We'll see you next year. Take care.